Well, good morning, everybody. I'm having to do what teachers do, and that is to adjust to changing circumstances. I got to school this morning and there's no internet. So I am out in my vehicle doing this in the front seat of my truck. So we'll see how it goes. This is episode 86, I believe, and I think I need to turn on my background light. Yes, I do. All right. Today's question is what made Miami a hotbed of covert CIA/organized crime anti-Castro activities? Miami, Florida, and of course, it's not just Miami. It will be in New Orleans and Dallas and other places as well, but deep south mainly. And I've got some pictures here of the Cuban people flocking to America. This, and obviously, Miami is going to be the recipient of most of these people. Bottom left, you see these Cuban boat people, or they're sometimes referred to as the raft people. And you can see how many people are on that little homemade raft braving the waters between Cuba and America to escape Fidel Castro, to escape the vestiges of the revolution. And these people are going to come to America in the thousands. Bottom right, uh, sometimes the lucky ones came in planes by the plane load. Upper right, you see makeshift shelters being put together in Miami, especially to handle the overflow. So many Cubans came so quickly. Um, and the promise was, you see here in this upper left picture, coming to America and the prospect of freedom, etc. And some did want to come to America and start a new life. They were content to stay, but most of these people that were coming for temporary refuge. They were refugees. They were coming here to uh, sort of, it wasn't intended to be permanent. They were kind of coming here to lick their wounds a little bit and reconstitute an effort to get back home, but that would mean they would have to overthrow Fidel Castro. And so what you see when a lot of these folks arrive is this built-in, this residual desire to form paramilitary groups and train and maybe even get the support of the United States government so they could go back and get rid of Castro and reclaim their country. One of the most impactful and famous of these paramilitary groups was Alpha 66. And indeed, they did get the backing of the United States government, i.e., the CIA. Um, and of course, it was perfect. The American government wanted to get rid of Castro too. So here you have all these foot soldiers at your disposal. All these Cuban refugees are extremely motivated. They'll train, you give them some weapons and give them some training, and they'll be the ones lay their lives on the line to go invade Cuba and try to overthrow Castro for you. And all you got to do is give them the money and the training, yeah, and a ride over possibly. So here you see these Cuban refugees training. They will later make up the force that does go to Cuba at Bay of Pigs. We call them the Cuban Brigade. So organized crime will get involved in this whole endeavor as well. And they also will use a lot of these Cubans, especially Santos Trafficante, who sets up shop in Florida. Of course, we've already learned Santos was the head of the crime organization in Cuba. So he wants to get back home. So he's going to use a lot of these Cubans as foot soldiers as well. There's some more of these. There was a bunch of splinter groups. Alpha 66 was kind of the main one. And then there was the DRE, as you see pictured above. You got the Cuban Brigade down below. Those are the ones who went to Bay of Pigs. In the middle, you got the MRR. Uh, and you know, they all have their different little. It's kind of like religion, you know. You got Church of Christ, you got Church of God, you got Baptist, you got Methodist. You got a lot of different folks, a lot of different spins on their faith. It's the same thing with the Cubans, and so we are beginning our look at conspirator number 3 today. And of course, if you haven't picked up by now, conspirator number 3 is the anti-Castro Cuban community down in the southern, deep south, the southernmost part of the United States, mostly Miami, but spreading into New Orleans, Dallas, and other places in the deep south, wherever these anti-Castro Cubans are settling. Cuba itself, as you can see, there was a before and after. It's kind of like those diet pictures or commercials you see on TV. Uh, the downside of America and Cuba's relationship in the 50s, the upside was easy to see. There's a lot of money flowing through Havana, and you can see on the left what Havana looked like um, in those days. A lot of activity. Havana was a place to be. It was the rich man's playground. Wasn't great necessarily for the Cuban people themselves, uh, which is why Castro had a reception. That's why he had people that were on his side because they were tired of being exploited by America and Americans. But the downside is after America was kicked out and the revolution succeeded, late 59, early 60, away gone with America is all its money. Kicked out all the companies, you kicked out the government, you kicked out the mafiosos, and behind you end up with this sort of this country that falls back into the third world uh, sort of climate. You can kind of see what Cuba starts to look like. This is the reason why, we cut them off. Remember, we cut them off. We stopped trading with them. We put an embargo on them. We started treating them like an enemy because of Castro. And so he turned to the Soviets. And, you look around the Soviet Union during those days, and it wasn't exactly swimming in luxury either. So they went from a luxurious business partner to a not so luxurious business partner, which means their country changed along with their government. And, a lot of people wanted to go back to the way, they certainly maybe didn't want America exploiting it like it had been, but they sure did appreciate that the money that came with the relationship that they had with the Americans. And they certainly didn't want Castro. Castro was on a tear to uh, enact vengeance on all his enemies, political or otherwise, in Cuba. That's why so many people fled. They thought they were going to be hanging at the end of a hangman's noose. So this is a picture of an airlift where people are fleeing persecution and poverty in Cuba. This is the same old story you get of anyone who flees any country for any reason. It's usually one of three reasons. It's usually either political persecution, religious persecution, or poverty. You think about the Irish who came to America, it was because of poverty and a famine. You think of other folks who came, and even at the beginning, they were tired of tyranny. They were tired of being told they had to be in the state church or so that. Well, Cubans aren't any different. And there was an added element to it. The political persecution wasn't just that you had to be in there in the party. It was such that Castro and his regime was running around executing anybody who wasn't so a supporter of the revolution. And there was a lot of folks in that camp. So they're crowding onto these planes, they're getting on those rafts, anything that'll float, anything that'll fly, coming to America. And at first, Castro was uh, okay with that, you know, get him out of his hair. But there were so many of them, it was embarrassing to Castro. It was embarrassing. It's kind of like, you know, Soviet Union when so many people in East Berlin were fleeing to West Berlin. And it was embarrassing to the Soviets that so many of their own citizens or people underneath the auspices of, of the Soviet Union, under the control of the Soviet, so many people were fleeing to go to freedom. So they built a wall. Well, in Cuba, so many people were overwhelming the immigration office in Miami, and the people were constantly flowing out of Cuba to go to Miami. The U.S. Embassy, here you see a picture of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. People are just lined up waiting for the doors to open. And it was embarrassing to Castro, so he shuts the embassy down eventually. But for a period of time, a lot of these Cubans could get out, and until Castro shut it down. And so here you see in Miami, South Florida, temporary shelters having to be built, springing up everywhere. And again, I cannot emphasize this point enough. The Cuban refugees never intended to stay. These are folks that are coming to find a place of temporary refuge, and they're going to join these paramilitary groups, and they're going to get trained, and they're going to get supported with weapons and money, and they're going back. Their intention is to go back and to get rid of the scourge, Fidel Castro, and and uh, and it might even work out better. They weren't real happy with Batista either. They didn't like Batista either. Castro's no good, but Batista wasn't much better. So best case scenario is they go and they get rid of Castro and they create a government of the people, you know. And so it's they had some dreams for Cuba of the future, and it was going to involve sacrifice, but they were willing to pay that price. And of course, the United States can play a big role in this. About that same time, all this is happening. All these Cubans are flowing into America, and we got this threat 90 miles off our coast. We have the 1960 presidential campaign, and JFK's run against Nixon. And JFK made a big deal about how he thought the Eisenhower administration wasn't doing enough to help these Cubans. They weren't doing enough. And he threw it in Nixon's face constantly. It was really aggravating to Nixon because he knew a lot of the covert stuff that was going on. He knew Operation 40. He had already green lighted to the 5412 committee. And as a result of Operation 40, this Cuban brigade was being trained for a Bay of Pigs invasion. He knew these little groups like Alpha 66 and some of the others we're going to talk about are being formed as they spoke. And it was all in an effort to get rid of Castro and destabilize his government, et cetera. He knew all that, but he couldn't say it because it was classified. So he just got beat over the head during a 60 campaign by JFK. So the upshot of that is JFK raised the hopes of these Cuban refugees that he was going to be on their side, and even more so than Nixon. They already knew Nixon was on their side. It was his government that was supporting everything that was going on. But JFK's up in the ante, and so you can see why they would support him. Well, uh, we can't lose either way. They're both anti-Castro. They both want to get rid of Castro's government. They both want us to be able to go back home and form a government that's freedom loving and America loving, et cetera, et cetera. So we can't go wrong either way. But JFK went even a little bit further. And so, of the two, it's a binary choice, you got to pick one. So most of these anti-Castro Cubans threw their lot in with JFK. And I wanted to today kind of show you how many, just all these different groups that have formed down in the deep South, in Florida especially. And how intense they are about their purpose. Thousands of anti-Castroite Cubans are now living in Miami as basically refugees. And they began forming or joining a variety of organizations that are all being supported by prominent American entities. For example, some of them are big business entities that are right-wing types. It's like Henry Luce, who you see pictured on the right here, owner of Time Life magazine, and his wife, Claire Booth Luce, pictured on the left, taking the photograph. Uh, these are right-wing zealots, all right, and they don't want Castro 90 miles off our coast. They don't want communism in our hemisphere. William Type Pawley, we've already talked about Pawley. He's a big business tycoon. It was his yacht, if you remember, that was dropping the S Force off, and he was the one that told John Martino that they're going to kill Kennedy. He was a big friend of Allen Dulles, and so he was a business tycoon and a CIA sort of a non-contract employee. Carlos Prio, the former president of Cuba, who lost a power struggle to Batista and now wants to get rid of Castro. If you remember, Carlos Prio was the one that fled Cuba and took with him millions and millions and millions. He basically raided the treasury there. So he was rich, so he could afford to support. Now that he's in Florida, he could afford to take some of that money and support some of these groups. Roland Masfer, former publisher of Cuban newspapers, he fled when Castro. There's just almost an infinite number of financial backers willing to put up their own cash to pay for these anti-Castro groups. They're all right wing. They're all anti-communist. The CIA is also involved in this, and they're creating these groups, and they're the ones they're they're using front companies and things to funnel money to them. They're getting weapons to them, and they're handling all the training. So the U.S. intelligence is very involved, and then the crime bosses, crime bosses who had great motive financially to want to get back into Cuba. They're losing $100 million a year not being in Cuba. So Santos Traficante, Sam Giancana, Carlos, probably the biggest of the three, though, is Santos, because he's still presently considered the crime boss of Cuba, and he has a little personal motive. Castro had arrested him, was going to execute him. If it hadn't been for Ruby, probably would have been executed. Santos would like to go home, and he is sort of working. These Cubans that all come to Florida with him, they sort of look to him as their leader, which is why every time U.S. intelligence, the CIA wants to work with these Cubans, they go through Santos, because Santos is the guy who is sort of the leader of all these Cubans. So if you can get Santos on your side, you're going to get all these Cuban refugees on your side. So I mentioned Alpha 66. We've talked about Tony Cuesta before and Eddie Bayo. These are the guys leading Alpha 66. And their job is to sabotage and attack Cuba economically, politically, mainly economically, and try to disrupt business in Cuba and cause life to even get harder there so people will turn against the Castro government. So they're attacking port installations and shipping and ships and things of that nature, acting basically as offshore pirates. They sank a Russian ship called the Baku. This was reported in Life magazine in '63. If you remember now, Life magazine is the reason we know about William Pawley and the exploits on his yacht with the S Force, because they had a reporter embedded on the boat to record and write a story, take pictures of the S Force and their exploits. If they could get those two Russian officers offshore, help them defect to the United States. It was going to be a big write-up in Life magazine. It was going to be very embarrassing to JFK and all that. We told that story. Life magazine was sort of the kind of like the unofficial news magazine of all these anti-Cuban activities. anything intelligence related. It was a very far right magazine. It's owned by the Luces, and they're in tight with all these power brokers, and so they kind of use Life magazine as their mouthpiece. So if you wanted to know anything that was going on, the anti-Castro movement, just pick up a Life magazine in those days. Chances are you'd see an article, probably some pictures. They had unusual access because they were supporting them financially and they were clearly on their side. Claire Booth Luce, uh, who was the wife of the owner of Time Life, told Gate and Fonzie in the late 70s, he was a House Select Committee investigator, that William Pawley was sort of the one behind all these attacks. He had organized them. She said that, quote, Pawley got the idea of putting together a fleet of speedboats, seagoing flying tigers, as it were. The flying tigers was his airplane unit in World War II that, uh, you know, he called them the flying tigers. And they had some heroic tales from World War II. And so he was trying to put together a naval version of that, I suppose, and they would be used by the exiles to dart in and out of Cuba as intelligence gathering missions. And and the reason she knew about this, she said, because he asked her to sponsor one of these boats, and she agreed. So evidently, there were several boats, and each one had a crew, and each one needed financial backing to sponsor the crew and the boat and all the missions. So he went around to all his rich right-wing friends and got uh, supporters or sponsors for each boat. And Miss Luce, Claire Booth, was one of them, which explains why Life magazine was always embedded with these boats. They got it was Life magazine. It was supporting a couple of these boats. Author John Newman wrote in his book, Oswald and the CIA, that Pawley was working for the CIA in Miami, arguing that he was involved with Harold Hunt. This is one of these big right-wing guys of Texas, big oil guys, big backer of LBJ. And so here we see where a lot of this financial backing is coming from. It's coming from these big right-wing business people. The owner of Time Life, the owner of the big oil company, Hunt Oil. James Hosty, an FBI agent out of Dallas, said H.L. Hunt was backing Pawley's people, and they were also getting support from Henry Luce. So you can see kind of how this is working, this network. You got these anti-Castro Cuban organizations that are raiding the homeland, Cuba. They're getting sponsored by right-wing business owners, big money people here in the United States are also getting weapons and training from the CIA. CIA is using front companies down there to launder money through to support these groups. And then obviously organized crime is involved with these groups as well. One of the primary guys in this whole movement is a man known as Maurice Bishop, Antonio Vecenia. Uh, Sometimes I've heard it pronounced different ways. Antonio Veciana that's usually the way it's pronounced. So let's just stick with that. So Antonio Veciana, who is the founder of Alpha 66. So he's the guy pictured right here in the middle. You got Lee Harvey Oswald on the right. You got David Atlee Phillips on the left. According to Veciana, all of his interactions with David Atlee Phillips was through a code name, Maurice Bishop. He never knew him as David Atlee Phillips. He knew him as Maurice Bishop. And according to Veciana, this was his U.S. intelligence contact. So, again, the CIA is creating Alpha 66, and Alpha 66 is a creation of the CIA. The CIA put this thing together, and his boss, so to speak, is Maurice Bishop. He said he met with Bishop more than 100 times over a 13-year period during this decade, a little more than a decade. And during that time, Bishop directed him to organize Alpha 66. So again, this is CIA directed, and paid him a handsome sum to do this, 250,000 plus. And also mentioned that right before the assassination in November of 63, which happened in November of 60, in September, 2 months before, he met with Bishop in Dallas and Lee Harvey Oswald. And there are witnesses to that meeting who said they saw Lee Harvey Oswald with Vessiana and David Atlee Phillips. Now, of course, the Warren Commission will later deny that and claim that they don't know who Maurice Bishop was and et cetera, et cetera. But that is basically how according to Vessiana, that's how the organization worked. He was under the direction of a CIA officer, David Atlee Phillips, and he met with him, he got money from him, and that's how his organization came to be. Excuse me just a second. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had other teachers asking me about the internet. They see me out in my car and they're like, "What are you doing out here? Is the internet down?" Oh no. We're all in the same boat. Another offshoot of Alpha 66 is the DRE. I mentioned that earlier. These are it's called the Student Revolutionary Directorate. And this was actually an organization that started in Cuba itself and then transported across the water to Miami. It was originally a protest organization against Batista, the government of Batista, but they were also opposed to Castro. And so most of its leaders, when Castro took over, fled to the United States. And in 62, Manuel Salvat became the leader of the DRE. And Salvat, like Vessianos, claims that when they got to the United States, the CIA became their main financial supporter as well. So we have two organizations now. We have Alpha 66, we have the DRE. Both of these are backed by the CIA. A third organization is the MRR, which stands for the Movement for the Recovery of the Revolution. Its leaders were Manuel Artim and Tony Verona. And this is kind of a very conservative, or it's just, some of these are more conservative, some of these are less conservative. This one was a very anti-communist organization. Another one was JDGE, sometimes referred to as Judge, an organization headed by Carlos Prio. He's the former president of Cuba. And then those with more liberal views tended to favor Manolo Rey and the Jour party. If you remember the Odio sisters, we talked about Odios when they were in Dallas and ran into somebody claiming to be Leon Oswald. They were prominent in the Jour party. So far, what we've learned is that there's all these Cubans have come to America. They don't want to stay. They want to go back, but they got to get rid of Castro. They don't want to go back to Batista. They don't want Castro. They want a new government. And so they have formed all these organizations. Some of them are more militant than others. Some are more political. Alpha 66 is militant. Its job is to do the actual overthrow of Castro. So they need military training and weapons. They're getting backed by the CIA. The DRE is more of a political organization, and they would probably most likely be involved in whatever government if they can succeed in overthrowing Castro. The DRE views themselves as sort of the ones that be involved in the political maneuverings that would take place in Cuba afterward, the formation of a new government. Then you have the MRR. These are another anti-Castro group, and the judge and Jour and all these different organizations. They're all maneuvering, and though they all agree on the big picture, which is they don't want Batista and they don't want Castro. They want a new government that's strictly Cuban for Cubans. But they have little subtle differences, which is why they become these little offshoots of Alpha 66. But the point is, there's all these different organizations down here that you can belong to. And you just pick and choose which one. There's the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CRC. This was if you remember the story of when Oswald got arrested in New Orleans for fighting with for that fist fight he had with that. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I can't remember the guy's name. It'll come to me. But anyway, that was the guy he was feuding with, the CRC guy. Because remember now, Oswald, the whole time he's in New Orleans, that summer of '63, he's infiltrated these anti-Castro organizations because he is he's helping with Operation Mongoose. So he knows all these people, even though at the same time he's being sheep dipped as a pro Castro guy, which is why he got in that fight on the street um, with that Cuban revolutionary guy. Anyway, these are the guys that are going to eventually be known as the Cuban Brigade, go uh, invade at the Bay of Pigs. And they're spread out in all these different bases. In southern Florida, we talked about all the different Operation 40 bases down in the Keys and Lake Pontchartrain. There were two of them right there outside New Orleans, and they had them in the Everglades, and all these different places. They had about five of them, and they're all getting. You can see here, they're getting it's paramilitary training. They're learning how to conduct themselves as a sort of like a military organization to invade Cuba. And it's all this training and sponsorship is by the CIA. Here's another, these, where do you think they got these weapons? None of these weapons are coming from the Cubans themselves. They didn't have access to any of this. This is all American weaponry coming from the CIA. And this is at a base in Texas. So they're just spread all over. It's kind of, you see the supply line here, Dallas, New Orleans, Miami. Those are the three biggies. All right. And then they put the bases in out of the way locations near those three places. But New Orleans uh, is it's interesting because when you get into the study of the assassination of JFK, uh, these three cities are the three cities. It's everything that's happening in these three cities is is uh is from the anti-Cuban or anti-Castro standpoint is with an eye towards overthrowing Castro. And so you have all of these elements uh, prominent in all three of these locations. You have the CIA, you have the anti-Castro Cubans, obviously, they're the foot soldiers, and then you have organized crime. I mean, you can't go to any one of the Dallas, that's Carlos Marcello territory, but Jack Ruby is sort of he's involved with organized crime there. Um, and New Orleans, it's Carlos Marcello, that's his headquarters. And then you get into Miami, that's Santos Traficante. And so that's the organized crime element, and the CIA is fronting all of these groups. So they're down there. And we already learned about New Orleans. It was Guy Bannister and David Ferry and Dr. Alton Oshner. These are all CIA people. Lee Harvey Oswald, uh, uh, the Clay Shaw. I mean, they're all CIA. And same thing down in Miami. Vesiano is running Alpha 66. They got the big JM wave station down in Miami. Uh, and that's William Harvey and E. Howard Hunt, all those guys. Those are all CIA. And so you figure if the assassination is going to take place at any one of these three locations, it's going to have, it just stands to reason these three entities are going to be involved in it because they're involved in everything in these three cities. Because anyway, so obviously the assassination happened in Dallas. It would have happened a couple weeks earlier in Miami if it hadn't leaked out. And of course, the other location is Chicago. And that's what we've learned prior. It's because of the Sam Giancana's outfit and all and it was supposed to happen on November 2 in Chicago. So is it that surprising that the plot to kill the president is really focusing in on these cities where they have control, either through organized crime, the CIA, or the anti-Castro Cubans. They either have control of one or two or all three of those. All three of those are controlling what's going on in each one of those cities. So I don't think it's that surprising that the assassination happened where it did. Here's another picture of these Cuban exiles, and they're all being trained down on these bases by the CIA. And of course, meanwhile, the new president, JFK, is being told, oh, yeah, what's going to happen is we're going to land these guys. We'll go in with our little Air Force with the planes painted like Cuban planes. We'll take out the Cuban Air Force, and then we'll land these. And they're, because they're homegrown, these are Cuban people, all the Cubans still in Cuba will rise up and join this invasion with these forces, and we'll sweep across the island, overthrow Castro. That'll be that. Of course, it didn't work out that way. And really, what they were hoping was that once they landed, if they ran into any problems, which of course you always run into problems, JFK would support the invasion with American forces, and that would be the real invasion. This would be the tip of the spear to get everything started. But then the American forces would come in and clean everything up, and then Cuba would be ours. And of course, Castro would be out of the equation. Here's a little known fact about why none of these operations worked. I've heard so many theories about this. How could the CIA bungle so many? They've done so well in Iran and Guatemala and other places. How could they bungle Cuba so badly? Well, part of it was because they didn't get the backing of, JFK didn't authorize U.S. forces to come in and help clean up the mess like Eisenhower did in Iran and Guatemala. It wasn't entirely a CIA victory in Iran and Guatemala. A lot of it was because the U.S. forces that came in and cleaned up their mess. And JFK wasn't willing to go that far. But part of it also was because Castro, in and all these Cubans coming to Miami and other places, saw opportunities to embed amongst the anti-Castro Cuban refugee population spies that would report back to him. It was called the WASP network. These are Castro's spies here, and they have infiltrated all of these anti-Castro Cuban militant groups in Miami and other places. And so everything, they're receiving the same training. They know exactly what's coming from the CIA. They know how much money these groups are getting from these right-wing business people in America, like the Luces. They know about William Pawley and his yachts and all the boats that are going in and out, conducting these raids. And they're just reporting to Castro everything that they're doing. And so Castro in real time knows about everything. And it's one of the reasons why none of the assassination attempts ever worked against him, because he had advanced knowledge of the plots. And it's a big reason why Bay of Pigs didn't work out. When the invasion happened, they knew when and where, what beach, what day, what time, how many. They knew everything, and they were just sitting there waiting for him. So I cannot overstate the importance of intelligence. Castro was smart to have an intelligence network here in Miami so that he was, he was outnumbered, he was outgunned, and he knew the Americans were gunning for him, and he knew what that meant. It wasn't just the American government, it was organized crime, it was all these anti-Castro. There was an alliance of interests that were lined up against him. And so he had to use everything in his disposal to try to fend that off. And his spies were a big part of the reason why he kept succeeding against all these efforts. So the question that we started off with today was, why was Miami sort of the headquarters, the ground zero for all this anti-Castro activity? Well, some of it has to do with proximity. they were, Miami's closest to Havana, and all these raft people and people flying in, that's where they went. They didn't all go to Miami, but a lot of them did. Miami sort of, if you go down to Miami today, there's a very strong Cuban presence there. Cuban population is even a part of Miami. They call it Little Havana, you know. So some of them stayed. They got to like it, so they stayed. And of course, Castro never got overthrown, never got assassinated, so they never went home. So anyway, that became sort of ground zero, and it fanned out from there to those other two locations, New Orleans and to Dallas. Um, and who were the foot soldiers? Well, the foot soldiers in all of these groups, these organizations that got created by the CIA, by organized crime figures, and by these far right business backers, Alpha 66, the DRE, the MRR, Judge, Jur, the Cuban Revolutionary Council. My goodness, I've only named a few. There's a bunch of them. It would be like going down into the South in any typical small Southern town and counting up all the churches that are in that town. That's how many anti-Castro Cuban groups there were in the Deep South during this period. Everybody had the same overall goal, which was to overthrow Castro, but they didn't want Batista back either. And they wanted a new start for Cuba. But they all have their different little spin on it. Some were more militant, some were more political, some were more economic. And so they had their little denominations, so to speak, and different spins on the same Christian faith, so to speak. And the faith in their view was anti-Castroism. That was what united all of them. So, and of course, the CIA saw great opportunity in this. They wanted Castro gone too. And so they saw these anti-Castros as very convenient foot soldiers, very motivated foot soldiers. All you got to do is train them and arm them, and they'll go do the dirty work for us. And same with organized crime. They're very motivated, want to get back. These are their people. They know them better than anybody. It's one of the reasons why organized crime figures became so important in this whole enterprise, the CIA, because they became the liaisons. These Carlos Marcellos of the world, the Santos Traficantes, the Johnny Rossellis of the world, because they understood these anti-Castro Cubans better than the CIA did, and they had hold over them. They had sway. They were their leaders. So you work through their leaders, and you get them on your side, and you get the Cubans on your side. And then, of course, these Henry Luce, Claire Booth Luce, H.L. Hunt, William Pawley, all these anti-Castro far right business guys, people, men and women, lots of money to spend sponsoring all these activities. So here you have this this like mingling of interest, and everybody sees Cuba as a target-rich environment. Castro has to be gone. He has to be eliminated so that we can get back to doing what we do best. That's making money. Organized crime wants to get back into Cuba to make money. The anti-Castro Cubans just want to go home. They're probably the only one. They probably have the purest motives of everybody in this whole toxic brew. They just want to go home. But the folks running these anti-Castro Cubans, the folks that are in charge, the folks that are arming them and financing them, they want to get back into Cuba to make money. The CIA, you remember, the French Connection has been shut down by Castro. That opium and heroin smuggling operation that made the CIA millions, financed all their covert activities around the world, is no longer operational until they can get rid of Castro. So obviously they want Castro gone. And then, of course, they don't want a communist government 90 miles off our coast either. So you got the CIA with their interests. You got organized crime with its interests. They're losing $100 million a year, estimates, not operating in Cuba. So, and then these far right business interests, you know, we lost $700 million. Just American big business in general lost $700 million in assets that got seized or nationalized by Castro when he took over. And so our sugar companies, our utilities, mining interests, on and on and on, entertainment, things of that nature. They all want to get back there too. So it's about money to them. The anti-Castro Cubans are true believers. They're very passionate about not wanting Batista, not wanting Castro. They want to start their own government. And as long as JFK is through the CIA financing and arming them to go, they're behind him. If he ever jerks any of that funding, or if he ever jerks any of that arming of their groups, or shuts down their groups, or shuts down Operation Mongoose, which is sort of the umbrella organization that the CIA used to run all these different offshoots. If he ever shuts any of that down, they'll turn on him. They only support him. There's no passion for JFK necessarily from these anti-Castro Cubans. They're only supporting him because he supports their cause. If he ever turns on that cause, or if he ever doesn't support that cause, they'll turn on him in a heartbeat, because that's what matters to them. They're not real interested in domestic politics here at home, here in America. This isn't their home. They're interested in domestic politics, but it's back in Cuba. It's not here. So JFK is a vehicle for them by which they can achieve what they really want, which is to go home. So that's why Miami becomes ground zero for the anti-Castro movement. Again, proximity, and that's where most of the anti-Castro Cubans, refugees fled, and they all have the same goals. And so the CIA sets up shop down there. Operation Mongoose headquarters are right on the campus of the University of Miami there in South Florida, and that's the headquarters. And then it fans out to these other places. And the foot soldiers are the anti-Castro Cubans, who are the most motivated people in the world to want to achieve this goal. Okay. Like I said, I had to adjust today, so I came out to my car, and I'm watching all these teachers pull in, and they're seeing me and they're realizing, oh, the internet's out. And this day and age, if you don't have internet, I I get here early in order to get all my work done. The reason I able to do this in my truck is because I have internet in my truck. But if you don't have internet in your classroom, you really can't do anything. You can't even print a document. I can't grade anything. I got all these things I need to grade. I can't print any documents. I can't even open my grade book. I'm literally uh that's I'm literally helpless until the internet comes back on. Who knows when? This is a testing day. We're doing state testing today, and that's all online. So that'll be interesting. If we don't have internet, we can't do that. All right. So this was episode 86 and day 1 of Conspirator 3. We'll continue this topic tomorrow. Check out my website if you like, sphistory.com, and give my YouTube channel a look if you like. Sign up for it or register, enroll, whatever, subscribe, whatever the word is. It's free. Hit the thumbs up, hit the notification bell, and I hope until next time, I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you very much.